Hello and welcome to another episode of Chemistry. Today we're going to talk about fuel cells. So we're going to describe some fuel cells, what they look like, we'll compare them and see what the pros and cons are about using fuel cells. So what are fuel cells? Now I don't want you to freak out about fuel cells if you already know about galvanic cells. So really you consider it as like a subset of galvanic cells, and their purpose here is to convert chemical energy into electrical energy via spontaneous redox reactions. Sometimes we call them a primary cell because they actually can't be recharged. A very typical example of a fuel cell is your hydrogen fuel cell. Now, as I mentioned, it's very common, and let's have a look at it here. Let's look at the elements that we've got. First of all, we've got an anode and a cathode. That sounds very familiar. If you know about galvanic cells, you know that they're an anode and a cathode, usually in a half cell. And you'll see that a substance is oxidized at the anode, similar to what you have in a galvanic cell, where you see the electrons moving up outside the wire to the cathode where reduction takes place. As you can see here, something is reduced. Now, what else have we got? We've got an electrolyte here, and what the electrolyte does is it allows for movements of ions. Sometimes it's a membrane inside, but you're allowing for the movement of particular ions that are relevant to the actual fuel cell. You see that the fuel is being injected in one side so that it can, interact with the anode, and then whatever's left over is retained or taken back out. Air is the other part of a fuel cell. Air will come in so it can interact with the cathode and it will come back out. Now, the key with the fuel cell is that the fuel is the thing that's being oxidized. So in this case, the fuel that we're using here is hydrogen. And as you can see here, hydrogen is being oxidized. And as you can see here, hydrogen is being oxidized. So you can see hydrogen oxidized to hydrogen ions, and the releasing the two electrons that will move through the anode through the wire and the external wire over to the cathode. You see that these hydrogen ions will be moving across. Now you'll see why in a minute. If that's the case, the fuel is always being oxidized. If a fuel cell includes oxygen, then the oxygen is always being reduced if that's what's present. So as you can see here at the cathode, oxygen is always reduced if it's present as part of the reaction. So the oxygen, we're going to need some hydrogen ions, gain 4 electrons, and we'll create here is water. So water is released as a result of that reaction, and then it'll be drawn out of the fuel cell. So let's have a look at how to actually deconstruct a normal fuel cell. We have a hydrogen fuel cell with an acid electrolyte. That just means that in the electrolyte, I'm thinking about having the hydrogen ions. I have to figure out what the redox half reactions are at the anode and the cathode. Now, the anode here, we know that oxidation is going to happen. Cathode here, I know that reduction is going to occur. Now, if hydrogen is my fuel, hydrogen will be oxidized. If you go look on your electrochemical series, you'll see that this will happen. I'm going to have this. If you look on your electrochemical series, the half equation is already there for you. If we look at the cathode half equation, we think, well, oxygen is going to be reduced, and because it's an acidic electrolyte, it's going to be under acidic conditions. Okay. If you go and you have a look at your data book in the electrochemical series, you'll see that the reactions, I guess we can cheat and we can have a look at this one here, but that's the reaction that's going to occur at your cathode. So as you can see here, the cathode half reaction, oxygen is being reduced. At the anode, the fuel, which in this case here is hydrogen, that's going to be oxidized. This is really simple when you have your electrochemical series and what's going on with each of these substances. If ever you see oxygen, that's always going to be reduced as part of the reaction for a fuel cell. Just go and find the half equation for the fuel if it's something that's found in the electrochemical series. If it's not, that's fine because I know how to balance half equations. With a fuel cell, the examples that I've shown you so far are purely the hydrogen fuel cell, which is the most simple of them all. But when we talk about fuel cells, we're talking about fuels. And fuels don't have to necessarily just be hydrogen. Fuels can be common fuels that you'll see used in exam questions would be things like methanol or ethanol. Whatever the fuel, regardless of what that is, the fuel will always be oxidized. It's just going to be up to you to be able to balance these half equations for oxidation for each of these fuels, because you won't find these on the electrochemical series in your data book. And a vast majority of the time, if oxygen is present as part of the fuel cell and as part of the reaction, that is going to be reduced. So if you have a look here, say we've got methanol, right? Methanol is a fuel instead of hydrogen. Now methanol, that will enter and interact at the anode. Why? Because oxidation is going to occur there. So the methanol is going to undergo oxidation. The electrons will be released through the anode, flow through the external wire over to the cathode. At the cathode, as you can see, oxygen is the other substance that's involved in this fuel cell. So oxygen's actually going to go over here and interact with the cathode, meaning that it's going to be reduced. So reduction is going to occur there and water is going to be produced. You're going to think to yourself, when I use methanol, why is carbon dioxide being released? Any fuel, as you know, especially with combustion, that involves carbon, that you're going to produce carbon dioxide. So what you'll then do is to use that as clues to actually write your balanced half reaction. So if I was doing this and we've got this, right, and on the other side we know we've got carbon dioxide, then we just go through the process of balancing this half equation. So now we'll just do the balancing of the half equation. So I've got carbons, all good. Oxygens, I've got one more here, so I'm going to add a water here to balance it out. Now I've got 6 hydrogens there. And I'm going to balance out the charge, so this would be what your half equation would look like. At the anode it's probably going to be a gas, for methanol being used. It's up to you to be able to do that. What's good and what's not so great about using fuel cells? The great thing is you can convert chemical energy to electrical energy. If we use hydrogen as a fuel, as you saw, it's much cleaner because what we produce as a result of that is none of those sort of carbon dioxide, anything that's bad for the environment. So really, the hydrogen ions are produced, and if you're talking about the oxygen side, we produce water. So it doesn't produce these nasty greenhouse gases. The great thing is, as long as you have a continual supply of the fuel, you'll continue to make electricity if the reactants are available. So you can have a continuous supply if the reactants are available. And they're more efficient than your traditional combustion engines because you're losing a little bit less energy. The not so great thing is it's quite expensive. And although it's good to have a constant supply so you can get constant electrical energy, the bad thing is you need a constant supply of fuel. So as soon as the fuel supply stops or the reactant supply stops, you stop generating electrical energy. If you're using hydrogen, storage can be an issue. Hydrogen is really flammable. And not only that, it's a gas. So if you're thinking about putting it in your car, it has to be airtight. Otherwise, really bad things can happen. Challenges. We want to go down the fuel cells if we're using energy that's a little bit more renewable. We want to be using more sustainable fuels. A lot of the time, hydrogen is actually made from what we call a steam reforming process, which is actually uses fossil fuels as part of that process. So really, as a whole process of producing the hydrogen and using that as fuel cells, sure, when you use it in the fuel cells, it's great. It doesn't produce the greenhouse gases, but the process required to actually produce that hydrogen that we use does. You have to look at it from a holistic perspective. The other thing is, if you're using for the same mass, the hydrogen doesn't give as much energy. So you actually have to use a lot more hydrogen to get the same energy as a normal, as petrol in a combustion reaction, even though it's more efficient. Anything that's carbon-based is obviously going to produce carbon dioxide. So as we mentioned before, the example, ethanol, things like that, if we're using that form, you're going to produce carbon dioxide. But maybe there's hope because there are some studies being done to actually use the fundamentals of fuel cells, but also combine that with, biofuels. So an example of this is using what we call microbial fuel cells. And the thing is, the fuel in this case is you're taking organic waste matter, and what you're doing is you're allowing normally a bacteria or biofilm to be there. And what can happen is the bacteria can actually break down the organic substances to release the electrons, going through the wire, whatever it is over here, over to the cathode, right? And again, if we're using oxygen, we'll also then only produce water as the product. The other product that we'll produce, because it's organic compound, it's gonna contain carbon. But the great thing is this carbon can go back into the carbon cycle, probably be used by plant material and that sort of stuff. So it can, as a result of that, we would consider that much more environmentally friendly. Because again, firstly, it's not really coming from fossil fuels. And the carbon dioxide, because it's part of that carbon cycle where you're growing plants, the plants are breaking down, the bacteria are breaking down the organic matter to make a fuel. So sometimes it could be, say, ethanol or something like that. And then the carbon dioxide that's produced from that goes back into that carbon cycle for the organic matter to grow again, et cetera, et cetera. So this is an option for that to occur, where we're taking a more sustainable approach using the fundamentals of fuel cells to produce electrical energy. In summary, let's talk about it. So fuel cells, we can consider as a type of galvanic cell, and what we do is convert the chemical energy into electrical. Hydrogen fuel cells are really clean, a cleaner choice, but storage is an issue and production is an issue where you're forming it from the steam reform process that's actually requiring fossil fuels. The storage component, sometimes it makes me nervous because hydrogen is so flammable. It's so light, and so any container that carries it has to be so airtight. In a fuel cell, the fuel is always oxidized. If it's hydrogen, you can go to the electrochemical series and find the half equation. If it's a more complex fuel like methanol, you have to use your skills of being able to balance half equations in order to find the equation. Microbial fuels are a sustainable alternative, breaking down organic matter using bacteria who naturally do that anyway to produce a fuel to be used at the anode. And as we know, there's ongoing innovation, I guess, to try and address the fact that the efficiency but also the environmental concerns involved in using, I guess, specific types of fuels when you use fuel cells. Alrighty, hopefully you learn a little bit more about fuel cells and what they do. And always remember, no matter what anybody says, yeah, you can.